this second attempt works. First of all, I make no apology for being convinced that climate change is real and that it's been basically created or established by human activity on the earth. I'm well aware that not everybody has that view, even amongst us. I don't know particularly about this audience here, but amongst our wider community. However, whilst I'll make that point pretty clear about my position, it actually doesn't matter. So if you are just getting ready to attack me afterwards with all the reasons why climate change isn't happening, that doesn't actually matter, as you'll see. So we're going to hopefully be able to advance the slides. Yes, good. On the right there, you'll see the cover of a very recent report put out late November called The State of the Climate 2022. And that's produced every year or so by the Bureau of Meteorology and the CSIRO. Whether you think they're credible or not, again, I don't mind one way or the other. However, that is quite pertinent because it's very recent. Here's a couple of statements in that report. Well, we'll just quickly be sorry before I do that. After I've just explained a bit about this report, we're going to then look at what is climate change? What do we really mean by that? What the evidence for it is. But then we want to move on to talk a bit about what are our responsibilities as people on this planet? Does it matter what we do? Does it matter to the climate or anything else for that matter? And then I want to look at some very clear statements in the Bible that tells us that God is in control of everything, including the climate. And then finally, look at what God's going to do in the future. I can't tell you how soon in the future. I think most of us probably think it can't be very much far off, but we don't know for sure. Okay, so now just to clarify a bit more about this report that was on that screen there on the right-hand side. So it was put out on the 23rd of November. You can download it off the web easily enough. And here are some of their sort of headline comments in it. Changes to weather and climate extremes are happening at an increased pace across Australia. The key point there is increased pace. We all know that climate changes a lot from year to year and even decade to decade in our lifetime. But what that comment is saying is that the changes that occur are occurring a lot quicker. So that's important. Then it goes on and says, there has been an increase in extreme heat events, intense heavy rainfall, and longer fire seasons and sea level rise. It's saying each of those has increased in recent years, few decades. Next it says, the concentrations of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide are at the highest level seen on Earth in at least 2 million years. Now, I don't think anyone here or in the CSIRO or anywhere else has been around for 2 million years. And without worrying about the number, clearly they've got some techniques that they try to work out what the climate has been like long before we were ever born, long before anyone kept any records of the climate. I'm not going to go into that. That's very complex scientific stuff. But they do have ways of estimating what it was like a long, long, long way back. But they're saying that from all of those assessments that they've made, the amount of carbon dioxide and other things that are creating a greenhouse effect, and if you've got a greenhouse in your back garden, you know what that means. It's never been this high, ever. That's what they're saying. Then they're saying this year, for the first time, we've seen a mass coral bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef during a La Nina year. So that's never happened before, ever. There's been bleaching before, but not with this particular weather pattern. Again, I'm not going into any of these in detail, but you're starting to notice they're putting words on these that are not just saying it's changing, they're saying it's exceptional. We haven't ever seen these things before. And finally, they're saying that there will be, and there have been already, widespread impacts on Australia's agricultural industry, affecting food production and supply chains. And I think this year we're certainly conscious of that. So that's their professional and scientific opinion about what's happening. One other thing that I want to draw your attention to that they say, they've taken this issue of climate change to the wider community and said, how concerned are you about this? Are you concerned at all? Or you're just concerned, or are you very concerned? What's your opinion? So we're moving now from science to popular opinion. And here's sort of things they have documented. 75% of Australians are concerned about climate change, and the same level of concern was seen back in last year, 2021. The highest, both years, the highest since climate of the nation began. The intensity of concern has increased as well, with record high levels of those who are very concerned about climate change at 42%. So whatever you think about climate change, the point I really want to stress, because we'll come back to this, is that in the wider community, there is a great deal of concern about it. And that concern is manifested in all sorts of ways, including various lobbying and protests and people trying to buy electric cars or whatever, if you can get any, because you can't get them out of Japan or wherever they're made these days. Incidentally, we've got a hybrid on order. We were told 6 months ago we'd have it in 6 months, and they have no idea when it's going to come. So it could be another 6 months, who knows? By the way, the top 3 climate impacts of concern are more droughts and flooding affecting crop production and food supply, 83%, more bushfires, 83% also, and the extinction of animal and plant species, 80%. So you don't have to agree with any of that, it's just telling you what the wider community feels about this. Okay, I'm going to try and explain a little bit more of the technological side of this topic. I'm well aware that you may not be that interested, or you may not even understand some of the terminology. I'm trying to keep it simple. So here we go. So what is climate change? What are we talking about? Well, you'll see where I get this quote from in a moment. It's defined here as a change in global or regional climate patterns. In particular, a change apparent from the mid to late 20th century onwards, and attributed largely to the increased level of atmospheric carbon dioxide produced by the use of fossil fuels. So that's the definition of a particular source. But I've underlined a couple of terms there. It's a change in global or regional. Regional meaning a big chunk of the earth, not the whole earth, but a big bit. So we're talking about that's an area at least as big as the whole of Australia as a region. We're not talking about South Australia, and we're certainly not talking about Adelaide as an indicator, because that doesn't really tell you anything. You have to look at a much bigger area to get a sense of what's the average movement of climate. That's important. I'll elaborate on that just in a moment. So just one example of the sort of things that are being produced. This is from the British Met Office, and here it's talking about global average temperature. So that's every single weather station around the whole Earth, every day of the year, all added up and averaged each year from fair way back, as you can see on that chart. And it doesn't take much to be able to tell that those little lines are going up as you go across the screen. So they're identifying, since 1850, a clear trend of increasing average temperature across the whole world. We're not talking about whether we've had a higher temperature 3 years ago in Adelaide than we did this year. That's irrelevant. Absolutely tells you nothing. You have to look at a much bigger picture. And you'll see at the bottom of that bit there where it's from. Let me finish the quote. What's happening is persistent, meaning it's going on and on. It's not just a little passing phase. It's persistent and not a fluke due to some weather phenomenon. The long-term trends, and that's the key word, long-term trends are being driven by increasing levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Now that's from NASA. Now you might think, what's NASA, the people who send astronauts to the moon, got to do with the weather? Well, every time they shoot a rocket up and get one back again, they want to know something about the weather. And so they've got this huge group studying the weather and over a long period. So they've got their own information as well as the other sources I've mentioned. Now, the next point is we need to be clear what we're not talking about. There's a difference between weather and climate. Weather is the day-to-day state of the atmosphere and its short-term variation in minutes to weeks. We talk about changes in weather in terms of the near future. So weather is what you get on the news every day or in the paper or wherever you get your information about the weather. And they might look ahead a week, and you know that's pretty rough because it's very hard to predict a week ahead. So that's weather. We're not tonight talking about weather. We're talking about climate. Climate is the weather of a place averaged over a period of time, often 30 years. Climate information includes the statistical weather information that tells us about the normal weather, as well as the range of weather extremes for a location. So here you have to look at a much longer period to be able to tell whether it's changing or not, or it's just a normal sort of variation over every few years. It goes up and down. No, they're talking here about a much longer period to get a clear sense of a trend. as you'll see in this next little quote. Scientists study climate to look for trends or cycles of variability, such as the changes in wind patterns, ocean surface temperatures, and precipitation over the equatorial Pacific, the result of El Niño or La Niña events. So we're talking about long periods, big areas of the Earth. That's what we mean when we're talking about climate, as distinct from weather, which is it going to rain next week in Adelaide? They're quite different things. And just to show you how difficult it is to work out what the weather is, this is a picture of Australia. And there are various little letters scattered around that picture, which all these weather forecasters know like the back of their hand. But let me just quickly run through what some of these are. First of all, there's this IOD, which stands for the Indian Ocean Dipole. Next, there's an MJO, which is the Madden-Julian Oscillation. Then there's a ENSO, which is the El Niño or La Niña Southern Oscillation, the one you probably hear most of in the news. And then at the bottom, there's a little, there it is, there's a thing called a SAM, a Southern Annular Mode. So these are the things that are moving around every few months, and the weather forecasters have a great deal of complex analysis to try and work out which is moving where and what's it going to do to the climate and what's it going to do to little old Adelaide's weather. But there's another one that's a real funny one you don't hear much about, and that's this big circle here. It's called a blocking high. It sits between Australia and New Zealand occasionally. There's one there right now, which is why it's been so wet along the east coast of Australia, because the weather generally goes across that way. As you probably all know in Adelaide, weather tends to come from the southwest and drift across. If it's been hot in Perth, a couple of days later it's often hot here. So it goes that way, except there's something stopping that happening. So instead of all the wet from the north coming through and blowing across towards New Zealand or New Caledonia or wherever, it's being stopped, and it all falls down on Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria and Tasmania. Not here, but down there. That's why we've had massive floods and everything. Okay, that's all that technical stuff, if you like. Move on. Well, it's actually difficult to get all the detailed facts right, which is why there are people who say there's no such thing as climate change. We can continue polluting the planet. It's all fine, or whatever. They wouldn't say it like that, of course, but I suppose that's the effect. So why is it so hard to get the facts, particularly in this time in history? Well, we've all heard of fake news and conspiracy theories. They're terms that are fairly recent. Those of us who are older can probably not even remember hearing those terms when we were young. They're actually not that new. They're not really new. Here's a little cartoon from 1894. You may not be able to see it, but the chap in the middle has got a piece of paper, and on it is written, I've got two here already. You're right, thanks. I need 3 glasses of water now. How long do you think I'm going to be speaking? So he's got a piece of paper in his hand with the words fake news written on it. So it's actually been around over 100 years, this term. But there's some terms which are quite new, such as alternative facts. I don't know if you remember one of Trump's media people used that term when talking about how many people were lined up in Washington to witness his inauguration. And, somebody says, oh, it was the biggest crowd ever. And others saying, no, it was nowhere near as big as Obama's gathering when he was inaugurated. And somebody got a helicopter and counted all the heads and said, sorry, Trump, you didn't get the biggest crowd. And so they asked this media person, well, how do you account for this? And he says, oh, well, there are alternative facts. Now, you have to think about language here. Is a fact or not? Well, I guess we'd all say a fact is a fact. So can there be an alternative? Well, implicitly, no. That's an oxymoron. You can't say it's a fact, but there's an alternative fact of the same thing. So this is the kind of language we hear that is new. Then we have other things to worry about. There are websites, as many of us will be well aware, that can prove or disprove absolutely anything you can think of. Doesn't matter what it is. Absolutely anything. You'll find a website to support your particular view. And of course, if you think, good, I found one that supports my view, that must be right, you only have to say to anyone else, well, what do you think? No, well, I've got a website that says that's wrong. It's the opposite. Well, and of course, where do you go with them? How do you know which one's reliable? Are any of them reliable? So it's hard. And so that's the challenge. Where do we get our information from? Well, I'm just going to have a slight digression here because I think, forget climate change for a moment, I think this is useful to think about and come to terms with, because we have to deal with this. Doesn't matter what the topic is. So, there are people who believe or don't believe the following. There are more Muslims than Christians in Australia. President Obama is a Muslim. There are people who say that, and people who say, no, that's not right. There are people who say that vaccinations are harmful and COVID-19 is a hoax, and there are those who don't agree with that. There are those who say that Trump won the 2020 election, and there are those who say, no, he didn't. There are those who believe that UFOs are from another galaxy and man didn't walk on the moon. There are those who say that crystals can heal you and that drinking colloidal minerals gives you longer life. And by the way, if you've got white hair like me, if you have this stuff, it'll make your hair go black again. You haven't been drinking this? No, I haven't, obviously. There are those who say that mass shootings in America are faked because that's a way of trying to get control over guns and it's all fake. There are those who say that by mind control you can heal others from a distance. There are those who think that life continues after death. And I could go on and on. I don't believe any of those, just so you know. But the point is, all of those you can find support for somewhere on the web. This reminds me of something in the Bible. The Athenians spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear some new thing. That's in Acts 17, verse 21. And I think we have a modern equivalent of that. And it's called the internet and social media. You can spend your whole life finding and discussing some new thing that somebody has said. And you can argue about it or you can get excited about it, do whatever you like with it. And with that massive information, what do? I would be going back at least 20 years in one of the places I worked that we were told You've seen a lot of change in the last year or so with technology and so on. And the person said, "You've seen nothing yet." And he was absolutely right. Because what happened since then is gone way beyond what we could have imagined. And it'll continue. It'll happen next 20 years if we have that long. So if you're struggling with technology now, and some of us in my age group are, well, you won't have a hope in a few years' time because it'll just rocket off to wherever it's going. Well, let's just come back to our other slide for a moment to finish off this point. How do you define what a scientist is? Who's the reliable person? How do you tell? Actually finding out a scientist's relevant qualifications can be difficult. You can have someone saying they're Professor so-and-so in whatever. Well, it takes quite an effort to figure out whether he has any idea what he's talking about or not. Is he talking about his very special subject where you might listen to him? Or is he waffling on about something that he doesn't really know any more than you or I do? It takes time. And are you going to be bothered? Most people aren't. They just say, "Oh, Professor, oh, we'll believe that." Well, then you've got media reporters and commentators, most of whom aren't scientists. So how do they know what they're saying and what they're telling you is right or wrong? And we have a problem, each of us, because we have biases. You might say, "Oh, I don't have any biases." Well, there's your bias straight away. Your bias that you don't have a bias. Everyone has some kind of bias, and it's very hard to pick out what it is because you don't see it. Everyone else does. They go, "Listen, what he's saying is he's biased." So that's tricky. How do you objectively look at anything? Well, I've just got two things to suggest, and we've got to move on. There are websites, you can agree with them or not, but they say, at least, they are fact checkers. There's several of them, and they're often very large organisations that have access to a huge amount of information. And they will take whatever claim is floating around and they will compare it with what other people are saying. They'll interview experts in that field and they'll come together and say, "Well, we think that's true or it's false." You can decide whether you agree with them, but they're there. Saves you a lot of trouble. And can I suggest that rather than worry about the future, we stick to the past. The past is there. The data is there. And you may not be a statistical analyst. However, some of us have got some skills in that area. We can look at the data and say, "Well, there it is. I can understand that data, whether it be temperature or whatever it is." And as you've seen on a couple of slides earlier, there is a trend. That's the past. That's a lot easier to grapple with than worry about what somebody thinks is going to happen next year or 10 years or whatever in the future. That's much more difficult for anyone to do. Okay, moving on. My sources, generally speaking, have come from these areas. That's from NASA, that I mentioned earlier, from NOAA, which is similar in a way in that it's a North American organisation that analyses weather. We've got the Australian Bureau of Meteorology, the British Met Office, the CSIRO. They're the kind of sources that I use. Now you can say every single scientist in every one of those organisations has been hoodwinked, they've swallowed a conspiracy theory, or they're deliberately trying to confuse us or mislead us. Go your hardest. I think they're pretty reliable. I'm more interested in those kinds of people than an extreme left-wing or right-wing extremist who often has other agendas. A couple of pieces of evidence. A fairly simple one, I think. The blue ups and downs are the record cold snaps that have occurred. And you can see by the blue line that they're dropping off. We're not getting very many of them anymore, almost none. So over time, over this period from 1950, the amount of really cold weather extremes that have occurred have almost disappeared. On the other hand, the extreme heat records, that's like we've had the highest temperature ever in Timbuktu or wherever, the number of those has bumped up a little bit and then gone whoosh up. Now, that's just one simple way of seeing what's changed and how it is understandable that something's going on. They haven't happened before. In this 170 years we're talking about, that's the changes that we can identify. Now, the IPCC is not an organisation that everybody thinks is wonderful. It's the International Panel on Climate Change, whether you like them or not. Here's a little chart they produced recently, and they've gone from 1850 and looked at the changes in global temperature, and you can see that it's gone up. Now, you might say, oh, but that's happened before, 200 years ago, 500 years ago, whatever. Well, they looked at that question and they said, no, it hasn't. It's never happened before, ever. In this case, for 2,000 years. They have no way of indicating this has ever happened before. Be that as it may. What do you think of that? Here's Australia's temperature. So back from 1910 to about 1955-ish, pretty flat. Hasn't changed very much. From about 1955 to about 1990, started to bump up a bit. And since then, it's gone up a lot quicker. That's average across the whole of Australia. It's not about whether back in 1960 we had a heat wave in Whyalla that's never been exceeded. It's irrelevant. We're talking about averages across the whole of Australia over a fairly long time. Now, you still might think some of this is just left-wing loonies having a field day. Well, let me show you some other comments. You've probably heard of the National Farmers Federation. They're not exactly left-wing loonies. If anything, they're probably right-wings. This is what they've said. It's on the web, easily verified. The NFF recognises that climate change poses a significant challenge for Australian farmers. So they're saying it's happening. They're not saying, well, we're not convinced there's any such thing. They're saying, yes, it's real and we're concerned about it. They go on a little bit and say, as a nation, we must act to ensure that our economy is well placed to cost efficiently reduce our national greenhouse gas emissions profile. Well, that's not left-wing loonies. This is farmers who are very, if they're not extreme right-wing, they're certainly down the middle towards the right in politics. So they're saying it's real, we've got to do something, we've got to get rid of or reduce the amount of stuff we're putting up in the atmosphere. Here's another one, Business Council of Australia. Again, you wouldn't call them left-wing extremists. What do they say? For over a decade, we have supported strong action on climate change. We support the science of climate change. We support the Paris Agreement and transitioning to net zero emissions by 2050. So whatever you think about the science or whether you've got an opinion that interprets the data differently, these people say it's real. And this one, Bureau of Meteorology, you might say, well, they're perhaps not exactly concerned about economical factors. They might just be off in the clouds, as it were, excuse the pun. But anyway, they say, climate change is influencing the frequency and severity of dangerous bushfire conditions in Australia and other regions of the world, including through influencing temperature, environmental moisture, weather patterns and fuel conditions. Fuel conditions meaning the dirt, the bark and twigs and whatever grass on the ground that's going to burn. In particular, observed changes in southern and eastern Australia include more extreme conditions during summer, as well as an earlier start to the bushfire season, with dangerous weather conditions occurring significantly earlier in spring than they used to. So they're talking about the past. And one more, just to make the point. An organisation in New South Wales called Resilience New South Wales, headed up by Shane Fitzsimmons. He used to be the head of the Rural Fire Service. I've left out some of his colourful language. He had very little respect for climate change deniers, but I'm not going to insult you with his language. So I've picked out some more moderate language. We've accepted and integrated into all our planning the forecasts around the implications of climate change, particularly through a disaster lens, saying we'll have more challenging disaster seasons, more frequent and intense weather events. We've seen the evidence where the seasons are shifting and the seasons are changing. So absolutely, it's a reality of life, and it's one of the drivers behind this government creating Resilience New South Wales. Unprecedented natural disasters such as the recent 2019-20 bushfire season and record-breaking floods are certainly in keeping with climate science, forecasts and predictions of extended disaster seasons and more frequent and more intense weather events. Now, none of these sources are left-wing loonies or anything like it. A lot of them are very, very hard-headed business people and people who are dealing with the consequences of the climate changing. There's been some interesting evidence of that in Australia and elsewhere. If you're interested in the wine industry, here's something for you. The upside is that cold climates where grapes never used to ripen, such as in southern Tasmania, Canada's Niagara Peninsula and parts of New Zealand, now do regularly. Tasmania is producing some outstanding Shiraz, normally considered a warm climate variety. Brown Brothers, I happen to know a little bit about Brown Brothers, took the radical step of making a major investment in Tasmania a decade ago. It's actually a little longer than that, as you'll see from the date on there, it's 2019. They made a major investment a decade ago because, as Chairman Ross Brown observed at the time, the mainland was getting too hot for the particular varieties of grapes they were growing. And this next example is actually in Canada, and not only because I know a bit about Canada, but my nephew Mike Hill lived where this picture is going to be shown, in the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia. A warming climate has already helped strengthen Canada's major wine regions, from the Annapolis Valley on the east coast to the Okanagan Valley in the west. So there's the evidence, in one sense, of the shift of where you can grow things because the climate has changed. Okay, just one more on this side of the picture. Headlines from this year, just a few, I couldn't fit them all in. In Lismore, well, I don't think it's any surprise to you, they have the wettest 3 months on record. Sydney had the wettest year on record, and that was in October. And what about November, December to come? Which will even make the bigger number again. So it's not just the highest on record, it's way over the previous record. New Zealand had the hottest and wettest winter on record. Pakistan had the worst floods on record this year. In the USA, over July-August, there were 6 1-in-1,000-year rain events in a month. If you know anything about hydrology, and I happen to have knowledge about that, you may not, but just take it for my word for the moment, a 1-in-1,000-year event is extremely rare. They had 6 of them just in 2 months this year. China, the worst heat wave in world history, not just Chinese history, and the worst drought on record. In the UK, they had the worst heat wave and the hottest day over 40 degrees on record. Never happened before. Well, we have that every few years in Adelaide, over 40, yeah, so what? A bit hot. They've never had one. They had one this year. India had the highest temperature on record. Europe had the worst drought on record. Okay, enough of all that. I know I've laboured that, but I think it's really important, given that there is a degree of scepticism in the world and also amongst us. And if I'm going to, put it on record exactly what I think, I've done that, and you can see why I've said that. I'm not worried whether you agree or not. That won't affect where we're heading. I want you to come back with me to Genesis. Right back in Genesis 2. There's a few things that are interesting in Genesis, the first of which we're not going to read, but in chapter 1, there we're told that God created the planet and the life on it, including us, with the purpose of us having dominion over the fish and the birds and the cattle, etc. By the way, I don't know if you've noticed, it doesn't say dominion over the earth, the ground. It doesn't say that. It says over the animals. That's, I think, an interesting little detail which you can talk about later if you want to. Let's just come into chapter 2 and at verse 15. And the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend and keep it. Now, those words may be different in various translations, but tend basically means to work it. So that would include things like ploughing the ground, pruning plants that need pruning, or whatever it is you need to do to work in this garden. And to keep it, the idea of being watch over it, guard it, protect it. So you see, the general idea is that this garden needs looking after. And I think that's a principle that applies to us to think about our position in the world. We are meant to take care of the earth on which we live. The law of Moses had some interesting comments. The Israelites were told when they went into the land that they were to leave the land fallow in the 7th year. Now that takes quite a bit of a faith, doesn't it? To say, well, I'm going to get as much produce as I can for 6 years, and then the 7th year I'm not allowed to touch my farm and do anything. And the idea was the ground needs to be rejuvenated, needs to have a rest and become productive again. That's quite a challenging thought. And they were also told when they went into the land, do not cut down any fruit trees. Don't cut down the trees. And just because you're in a warfare doesn't mean you can go and wipe out everything. No, leave the fruit trees because you'll need them when you've taken over. And you'll be able to get fruit off it straight away, instead of having to wait 5 or whatever years before a new tree will bear fruit. Now, humans haven't got a great track record on this earth. Just a few examples here. We've wiped out the Mauritian elephant bird, the New Zealand moa, the Mauritius dodo, which is the picture there. Why you'd pick that name for an IT company is beyond me. It seems to me absolutely the opposite of what you should call a company name. But anyway, and the Tasmanian tiger, which is in the news this week, because they found another skin, hidden away in a back cupboard in some museum. Then there's an interesting comment in Romans chapter 8 that says, since Adam and Eve were on the earth, which we read about back in Genesis there, the whole creation is groaning. That's a very expressive idea, isn't it? And I think it's an apt one, particularly in our time. And the people on the earth are groaning as well, not just the physical planet, suffering from over-exploitation, whatever. Groaning is an apt description of the earth on which we live. Now, I want us to look at the next one. It's in Luke. And this is, I think it's fair to say this is the take-home message, although I'm not yet ready to stop talking, okay? But because I'll come back to this again. So, Luke 12, verse 4. And I say to you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body and after that no more that they can do. And in verse 7, but the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Do not fear. Therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. And in verse 32, do not fear, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. So there's just one example. There are many others. Just in that chapter, 3 times Jesus is saying to the disciples, don't be afraid. Don't worry about what's going to happen, whatever particular issue it was talking about. Do not be afraid. Fear not. We've seen that the society is concerned, very concerned, many of them. We are being told, don't be afraid. Don't get worried about it. That's an important principle, which is, as I said, the take-home message. There is another expression I just used about not worrying. Jesus says we shouldn't be worried. Matthew 6 is an example. And just finally on this point, we might be concerned about this government or that government here or overseas, wherever. Don't worry about governments either. Whoever's in power is there because God put them there. And I listed off several verses to establish that principle. The Bible's telling us you don't have to worry if you've got a crazy government who are doing ridiculous things, in your opinion, and damaging our way of life or whatever it is. Don't worry about it. God's got that in control. So that's where we want to move on to evidence that God is in control. We won't look at many of these examples, but just a few in a moment. First of all, God created the earth very good. Back in Genesis 1, it says that. He formed it to be inhabited. In other words, he didn't form it to be destroyed. He didn't form it to wipe out every living thing on the planet. He formed it to be inhabited. However, we know from earlier chapters in Genesis that mankind corrupted the earth in the days of Noah, so God destroyed all life other than what was in the ark in a global flood. I'm not going to get into a debate about whether it was global. I'm certain it was. my civil engineering background lends, in my mind, quite a bit of support to that notion. Anyway, you may or may not think so. I want you to come now to Genesis 8. There's a really important thing that we're told at the end of that flood, what God said. So, Genesis 8, verse 21. And the Lord smelled a soothing aroma. Then the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake. Although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease. So whatever people might forecast about what the climate's going to be like at the end of the century or wherever, that's something we hang on to. It's not going to end in the annihilation of life on the planet, whether it's in our lifetime or beyond. It's not going to happen. That's God's guarantee. Okay, just a few other quick examples of where God is in control, clearly manipulating what happens on the earth. He destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah by brimstone and fire back in Genesis 19, verse 24. In Egypt, he brought 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. Over a period of 14 years, he controlled the climate. In Exodus, God sent 10 plagues on Egypt and parted the Red Sea to save the Israelites. Many of those involved physical things on the earth and animals. In the time of Elijah, God stopped the rain for 3.5 years. But in all of that, I've picked out, if you like, some disaster examples. Over all of that, or under that, if you like to use it, look at it that way. The earth and all animals are the Lord's. God waters the earth. You might say, no, he doesn't. Evaporation comes out of the sea, goes up into the atmosphere, forms clouds, and they drift across, and the rain falls down again. That's where we get rain from. Well, Psalm 104 says it's actually God doing that. It's important to accept that as it says. But there's a big but to all of this. We can't turn around and say, that flood in New South Wales is because they're naughty people and God's punishing them. We cannot say that. We cannot attribute any particular natural event in our time to divine intervention. And there are several examples in the New Testament on this point. Okay, enough of that one. Moving on. What's God going to do in the future? Well, first of all, we're told at the end of human beings' control over things, where finally God will intervene, at that time it's going to be a time of trouble such as never was. So there will come a point, clearly, which will be much worse than it is today. We don't know how soon that is or how far off it is, but that's the description of the end of time as far as humans controlling the earth are concerned. Now, we'll look at another example, this one in Luke again, Luke 21. There's some interesting language used here by Jesus about what it will be like at the end of human management of the earth. Luke 21 from verse 25. And there will be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars, and on the earth, note this language, distress of nations. Well, you could say that's a pretty reasonable description of much of the earth today. With perplexity. Now, perplexity literally means at a loss for a way. You can't see the way out. You can't see the solution to the problem. Perplexity. The sea and the waves roaring. Then in verse 26, men's hearts failing them for fear. Note that word, we talked about it earlier. This is the take-home message. Their hearts are failing them for fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth. And a lot of people are exactly like that. They are really afraid of what's happening on the earth, what's happening and going to happen in the future. What's going to happen? What things are coming on the earth? For the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then it says, it's at that point, they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with power and great glory, and so on. Okay, so that's the description of the end time. Not quite there yet. We might see some of that happening already, but there's a little bit further to go. But clearly, in terms of how it was 100 years ago or 200 years ago, we're an awful lot closer, and we've got a lot more evidence that that condition is beginning clearly to have happened over much of the earth. A lot of people are concerned, not just about climate change, but other things too. However, all of this is to say there's nothing in all that about climate change. There are no verses in the Bible that say climate change is the final evidence that Christ is about returning tomorrow. No, there's nothing like that. The Bible doesn't say the end comes because of climate change or anything like that. Those verses we just read are quite broad. There could be any number of reasons why people are worried about the future. That might be one of them, but many other things too. What do we read Christ is going to do when he comes? Well, he's going to, first of all, appear on the earth. And that's in Acts 1 verse 11. He's going to return, the angels said to the disciples, just as he's gone into heaven, he's going to come back just the same way, in fact, to the same place, the Mount of Olives. And that's where the end of the end, I suppose it is. This period of end times will end when that happens. And he will do the following. He will raise the dead. He will save Israel from destruction. He will judge the world. He will set up the kingdom on earth. Now, I'm not sure about the sequence of those. That may or may not be the right sequence, but they're all plainly stated in the Bible that he will do that. But what about the planet? That's really, I guess, where we should focus this evening. Well, there's a few interesting verses here. Come with me to Revelation chapter 11. Just two examples is all we have time to look at. I'm cribbing time a little because we started late. So I'll hopefully get away with that. Revelation chapter 11. And there's some interesting language here in verse 18. The nations were angry, and this is God's wrath has come, and the time of the dead that they should be judged, and that you should reward your servants, the prophets and the saints, and those who fear your name, small and great, and should destroy those who destroy the earth. Interesting statement in view of what we've covered this evening. So you've got angry nations, you've got people destroying the earth, and God says, enough. Intervenes with his son coming back. He will do all those things. We talked about some of them already. He will raise the dead, judge them, reward the ones who have believed in him, and get rid of all this stuff that's going on the earth that's making a mess of everything. And there's some beautiful pictures of what it will be like. Come with me to Psalm 72. Just one out of many that we would love to spend time looking at, but we haven't time. But we'll just do this one, Psalm 72. And, well, there's such a lot in this psalm that we will just go to look at, first of all, verse 19. We'll start at the verse. The blessed be his glorious name forever. Let the whole earth be filled with his glory. Well, that's a very different picture from the way the earth looks today. But back in a few verses, there's some interesting descriptions about the productivity of the earth in verse 16. There will be an abundance of grain in the earth. On the top of the mountains, its fruit shall wave like Lebanon, and those of the city shall flourish like grass of the earth. Well, you know that most mountain tops, and we're not talking about Mount Lofty, that scarcely justifies the name mountain, but many parts of the earth where they have very tall mountains, nothing grows up there, nothing at all. Well, it's going to change. There'll be an abundance of grain on the earth. On the top of the mountains, its fruit shall wave like Lebanon, referring to the huge cypress trees that used to grow there. Big productivity on the earth will be totally different to what it is now. We've never seen anything like it. And look at these other examples. We won't turn them up. They're all in, several of them are in Isaiah. Isaiah 35, verse 1. The desert shall blossom as the rose. Verse 7. The thirsty land shall become springs of water. Isaiah 41. I will plant in the wilderness the cedar and the acacia tree. Isaiah 51. He will make her wilderness like Eden and her desert like the garden of the Lord. Amos 9. The ploughman shall overtake the reaper. And Micah 4, everyone shall sit under his vine and under his fig tree. So there's a snapshot of the change that will come once Christ is in the earth and ruling the world, and the physical planet will also change. And that's a great picture. And the nearest thing I could think of to illustrate it is Butchart Gardens on Vancouver Island in Canada. Thank you.